that little guy, big bureaucrat, big bureaucrat, was telling you what to do, how to think, where you could go, who you could talk to, whether you'd be employed. This is a guy who I think history will judge quite poorly. Now, it was a crazy time. I'll give him that. But the problem that he had and the bureaucrats around him had was that they were all scientists, right? They didn't have any economists in the group. They didn't have any psychologists in the group. There was no one saying, gee, maybe this whole shutting down of the schools thing won't serve American school children so well in the future. Maybe this whole social distancing thing will actually create mental health challenges in the future. Maybe you can't just rip people's livelihoods out from under their feet. I mean, there are businesses that shut down that have never reopened. There were things that were done that economies and people just can't recover from. But Fauci, being all about the science, only considered the science. That was it. And so they had a very narrow view of what should be done. I was called out at the time, and I stand by everything I said when I said, you know what? They're politicizing this. This is a whole other component of it, right? There was a political motivation going on as well, with the likes of Maxine Waters saying that she was never going to take a vaccine that was developed under the Trump administration. You had Kamala Harris saying similar stuff. I mean, think about that. It was all about Trump, not about what we were actually dealing with as a society. So that layered on a whole complicating factor that I think, in fact, contributed to him losing the election in 2020. They don't have that going on now. So it's a whole different ballgame in this moment in time. But Anthony Fauci, he's up on Capitol Hill, and he's trying to justify what was done. Look, have some humility, guy. A little humility would help. You know, people would actually be a little bit more forgiving if you actually just sort of said, hey, you know, we got this a little bit wrong. But he's never going to actually admit to that. Despite in private hearings, these were not televised, admitting that he had no clue. The whole 6 feet distancing thing, that was all just made up on the fly. Somebody came up with that one and they decided to go with it. I mean, do you remember when he told 60 Minutes on CBS News, Dr. LaPook, that you didn't need a mask? No, don't worry about masks. That turned out to be a lie. He just basically wanted to hoard all the masks for hospital personnel, and he didn't want you buying a mask. So he went on 60 Minutes to say, don't worry about the masks. You don't need one. And then, lo and behold, they're telling you to wear 2 masks, maybe 3. So what do you believe after a while? Look, Americans, you know, they only have so much trust in the system. And you just came and spent it all, Anthony Fauci. Do we have, Drew, the transcript that came forward where he's actually saying that he kind of came up with it out of a thin air? He can't even tell you how the 6-foot distancing rule ever showed up. I mean, unbelievable. Unbelievable. And yet today, he's there kind of saying, well, it was the CDC. It was the CDC. This is very different than what he said just a few weeks ago in the private testimony. Let's go to Anthony Fauci, ladies and gentlemen, there on Capitol Hill, showing just exactly his true colors. Here we go.
Do you recall if it was ever suggested to be 10 feet?
You know, I don't recall, Mitch, if it was ever suggested it was 10 feet, but when I made my explanation of what it was, I was saying that there was no trial that looked at 10 versus 6 versus 3 versus not even worrying about it at all.
So what was that all about? I mean, they came up with rule after rule after rule after rule, and they were so proud to deliver those rules. And they never thought about how any of it really affected people. They didn't care, it seemed. And then the Democrats got a hold of it all. And so once the Democrats got a hold of it, well, then it was, game over, because then it became politicized. Here we are. We've got the transcript that he originally said, and they said, do you recall reviewing any studies or data supporting masking for children, for example? And he says, well, I might have. I don't recall specifically that I did. Well, that's alarming. So there was no data, no studies that they were looking at saying, okay, we're going to mask all the kids. I mean, there were kids that really struggled to re-enter society because they had to wear masks for so long. And then all of a sudden, like, the mask's off. How do you communicate with people? They didn't learn sort of the basics of human expression. In Japan, there were consultants that were getting paid fortunes because they had to teach people how to smile all over again. And especially young people, especially little ones. Then he goes on to say that, specifically on this, there have been significant, it said, studies showing that there is, the question, I should point out that the lawmaker said, since then, it's been pointed out that people have had these problems, like young children especially, are now struggling. They can't speak as well, right? They can't articulate as well. And they can't express themselves as well because they were in these masks. Have you followed up on any of those studies? Have you looked at them, Fauci? Did you bother? Do you care? The answer is no. But I believe that there are a lot of conflicting studies too. I still think that's up in the air. Come on. You mean to tell me you don't buy the idea that if a kid sits in school in a mask for a year, that they're maybe not going to learn as much, they're not going to be able to articulate as much, and they're not going to know how to express themselves as much? Do you even need a study, Anthony Fauci, to understand something like that? I mean, wow, the arrogance that he has exhibited is extraordinary, is absolutely extraordinary. It's all about the science, all about the science, all about the science. I'm sorry, but you know what? If you were one bit of a scientist, you would understand that it's not just the science. It's also the economy. It's also mental development. It's a whole lot of things. That stuff matters, Fauci. It matters. MTG kind of taking him down. This was funny to watch. It's all about the science. Let's take a look. Marjorie Taylor Greene holding Fauci's feet to the fire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Fauci, you were quoted on CBS Face the Nation saying it's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci?
I am a scientist who uses the scientific method to gain information.
Yes, you said you represent science. Do you represent science, Mr. Fauci? Yes or no? Yes or no?
No, that's not a yes or no answer.
Yes, it's a yes or no.
I don't think it is.
Okay, well, we'll take that as a you don't know what you represent.
Oh,
You got to hand it to her on that one. I don't know what he represents. I'll tell you what, he represents Anthony Fauci. And there's this whole issue you see of just exactly how the whole coronavirus thing came to be. It turns out that U.S. taxpayers, courtesy of one of the foundations that Anthony Fauci and others had okayed to give money to, were actually helping to support a very small portion of the research that was being done at the Wuhan laboratory, where it is alleged that this virus came from. I shouldn't even say alleged. I mean, if it walks like a duck and looks like a duck, it's probably a duck. You weren't allowed to say this way back when. I think I'm clear to say it now. But this was like no-go territory. It's one of the reasons they were so angry with Donald Trump, because one reporter asked him maybe in May of 2020, hey, Mr. President, have you seen any evidence that suggests that maybe this virus could have come out of the Wuhan lab? To which he said, yes, I've seen some intelligence that suggests that's the case. And what do you know, Anthony Fauci and company, they went nuts. Why were they so hostile to that idea? Somehow they were worried we were going to get into some kind of World War III or whatever with China, or they were worried about CYA, right? It was a CYA moment. They were trying to cover their tracks because maybe we shouldn't have been giving money for gain of function research to that lab. I would just say, look, you ought to know who you're giving money to. You ought to know whether they follow basic protocol for safety standards. The Chinese media had done their own report a couple years prior, boasting about how some of the scientists there in that lab did not use the protocol, meaning the gloves, et cetera, that you'd want to use if you're surrounded by bats, and they boasted about it as though it was like some kind of, great thing. Look at how strong our scientists are. Taiwanese television did a story on this. It was very, very interesting. So Anthony Fauci, seemingly just in this CYA moment all of the time, and the bureaucracy that was built up around him was very impacted by the political undertones of what was going on, or undertones, overtones. I mean, there were people that hated Trump so much, they were willing to use this to help orchestrate who would be the next president. And, you know, look, it worked, right? They were able to, I think, really get people worked up enough that they also, to the Democrats' credit, did all their ballot harvesting and went and got all the absentee ballots, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's why it's so important what Lara Trump's doing right now. She said, hey, you may not like it, but you know what? We got to do the same game, right? We got to be able to play in the same kind of fight. And so you need to make sure that people are registered to vote and that you've got the absentee ballots and you do all the groundwork ahead of time, because this stuff matters. This is really, really, really important.